There is something happening inside the creative mind that neuroscience is only just beginning to fully map. And what it's finding is not what most people expect. We have this cultural story about creativity. The tortured artist, the eccentric writer, the genius who drinks too much and feels too deeply, and burns too bright and burns out too fast. We romanticize it. We mythologize it. We turn it into aesthetic. What we almost never do is actually examine the psychology underneath it. Because when you look at the research, the neuroscience, the clinical literature, the developmental psychology, what you find is not a myth, not a romantic exaggeration, something more interesting and more complicated and more important than the story we've been telling. Creative people do not just think differently, they perceive differently. They process differently. They experience the same reality that everyone else is living in and extract something from it that most people walk straight past without noticing. And that capacity comes with a set of consequences that nobody prepares you for. That is what we are examining today. Let's start with the neuroscience, because this is where the conversation usually gets vague and I want to be specific. For decades, the dominant model of the creative brain was the right brain-left brain split. Creative people are right-brained. Logical people are left-brained, clean, simple, not supported by the actual neuroimaging research. What the research actually shows is more interesting. Neuroscientists studying creative cognition have identified a network of brain regions called the default mode network, the network that activates when the brain is at rest. When you are daydreaming, mind-wandering, making unexpected connections between things that don't obviously belong together. In most people, this network deactivates when they shift to focused work. The resting state and the working state are mutually exclusive. In highly creative people, the default mode network remains more active even during focused work. The connection between the resting imaginative state and the focused executive state is more fluid, more permeable. What this means in practical terms is that creative people are simultaneously running more cognitive channels than the average mind, focused on the task, generating associative connections, processing emotional content, all at the same time. That is not a superpower without a cost. That is an extraordinarily busy internal environment running continuously whether the person wants it to or not. Here is the first thing that cost produces. And it is the one that creative people almost universally report but rarely have language for. The inability to be fully present in ordinary life. Not because they are arrogant or disengaged, because their mind is always partially somewhere else, always processing, always finding material, always making the thing that just happened into something it could become. A writer at a dinner party is at the dinner party. They are also watching it. Noticing the specific way someone's expression changed when a certain name was mentioned, filing the exact phrasing of an argument for later, experiencing the evening as both participant and observer simultaneously. This is not a choice. Researchers describe it as a default perceptual mode, a baseline way of processing experience, running in the background of every interaction, every environment, every moment. And what it produces is a very specific kind of loneliness that is difficult to explain to someone who doesn't experience it. You are never entirely inside the moment you are in. There is always a part of you watching from the outside, and the people around you can feel that distance without being able to name it, and you can feel them feeling it, and you cannot fully close the gap because the gap is not a choice. Now let's talk about sensitivity, because this is the piece the cultural narrative gets most wrong. We tend to frame creative sensitivity as emotional fragility. The artist who falls apart over criticism, the writer who can't handle rejection. We pathologize it or romanticize it, but we almost never look at what it actually is. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people identifies a specific neurological trait, characterized by deeper cognitive processing of sensory and emotional information, greater awareness of subtleties in the environment, and stronger emotional reactivity to both positive and negative stimuli. This is not weakness. This is a different calibration of the nervous system. For creative work, this calibration is invaluable. The writer who feels other people's emotional states with unusual intensity has access to a depth of human experience. That translates directly into work that readers experience as true, But that same calibration means they absorb criticism at a depth that other people don't. They experience failure with an intensity others don't. They are affected by conflict, by cruelty, by the constant low-level harshness of a world not calibrated for sensitive nervous systems, with an impact that accumulates in ways that are not always visible until they become impossible to ignore. The sensitivity that makes the work possible is the same sensitivity that makes the life harder. You cannot have one without the other. I want to talk about the relationship between creativity and psychological instability, because this is where the research is most important and most misunderstood. The link between creative achievement and mood disorders is one of the most consistently replicated findings. In psychological research, K. Redfield Jamison's landmark work found elevated rates of depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety in writers, poets, artists, and musicians compared to the general population. And immediately there are two wrong responses to that finding. The first is to romanticize it. To treat psychological suffering as the source of creative power, this is a narrative that has cost actual human lives and does not hold up under clinical scrutiny. The second is to dismiss the connection entirely. That does not hold up either. What the research actually suggests is that the neurological characteristics that support creative cognition, the heightened sensitivity, the fluid associative thinking, the depth of emotional processing, are the same characteristics that under conditions of stress or trauma can manifest as mood disorders. It is not that suffering creates art. It is that the neurological configuration that enables artistic perception also carries elevated psychological risk. The same wiring, expressed differently under different conditions. That means supporting the mental health of creative people is not a threat to their creativity. It is the maintenance of the very system the creativity depends on. Here is the one that I think is most important and least discussed: the psychological experience of making something and putting it into the world. We talk about creative courage in vague, inspirational terms. Put yourself out there, be vulnerable, share your work, like the instruction is sufficient. What we do not talk about honestly is what it actually costs. When a highly sensitive, deeply processing individual makes something, a painting, a novel, a piece of music, they are not producing a product. They are externalizing an internal world, taking something that existed in the private space of their perception and making it public. The exposure in that act is not comparable to ordinary professional risk. It is closer to what psychologists call identity exposure, the vulnerability of having your actual self, not a performance of yourself, encountered and evaluated by other people. Rejection in that context does not land the way professional rejection lands for most people. It lands as a statement about the validity of your perception, about whether the way you see the world is something the world wants to receive. This is why creative people can appear to have a disproportionate response to criticism. It is not disproportionate to what is actually being threatened. It feels existential because at some level it is existential. The work is not separate from the self. It is the self made visible. For most people, identity is anchored in external structures: job title, relationship status, social role. For highly creative people, identity is anchored in the work itself, in the act of making, in the creative capacity that feels like the most essential feature of who they are. This means that when the work is going well, the sense of aliveness and purpose is extraordinary. Research on creative flow documents this as one of the most positive psychological experiences the human mind can have. Deep engagement, radical presence, the sense of doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And it means that when the work is not going well, the identity threat is total. Not "I am having a difficult professional period." Something closer to "I do not know who I am right now." That oscillation between the extraordinary aliveness of creative flow and the identity destabilization of creative drought is one of the defining rhythms of the creative life. And most creative people navigate it without any framework for understanding why it feels as extreme as it does. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of the creative mind is not a story about special gifts and romantic suffering. It is a story about a specific neurological and psychological configuration that enables certain things, demands certain costs, and has specific needs that a world calibrated for a different kind of mind consistently fails to meet. Creative people are not more fragile than other people. They are more exposed. The depth of processing, the sensitivity of the nervous system, the porousness of the boundary between internal and external world. These are not weaknesses. They are the mechanism. They are what the work comes from. What the research actually supports is this. Creative people thrive when they have genuine community. Not just other people who make things, but people who understand the specific psychological landscape of making things. They thrive when they have frameworks for understanding their own psychological rhythms rather than fighting against them. They thrive when they develop a relationship with their own sensitivity that is neither defended against nor surrendered to, but understood. The creative mind is not broken. It is not fragile. It is not a liability dressed up as an asset. It is a different way of being in the world, costly in specific ways, extraordinary in specific ways, and, more than anything else, it needs to be understood for what it actually is.